everyone, it's Katrinah. It's day 313 of our journey through the Bible in a year. It's going so fast. And if you're watching the day that this comes out, then yesterday was Christmas, and I hope you had a lovely Christmas with your loved ones, and just were able to really remember the reason why we celebrate in the first place. So today we are reading Acts chapters 6 and 7, and then just the very first part of Acts chapter 8. Bear with me, I'm getting over a cold. So I'll try to speak in a way that's understandable, but a little hoarse. Alrighty. So we're on Acts chapter 6, 7, and the first part of 8, right? And together they tell a really powerful story about growth, faith, and the cost of following Jesus. So in chapter 6, the early church is growing, and it's growing really fast, which is amazing. But growth can bring problems. One of the issues was that widows were being overlooked when food was being distributed. But instead of just ignoring it, the apostles addressed it head on. They appointed 7 men who were full of the Spirit and wisdom to help serve, and one of those men is Stephen. And so one of the things that stuck out to me about that was that God cares about practical needs just as much as spiritual ones. He wants his people fed and clothed and housed. And serving tables mattered. Organization mattered. And Stephen, he didn't start as a preacher. He started as a servant. But Stephen doesn't stay behind the scenes for too long. He is described as full of grace and power, doing great wonders. And that gets him noticed, but not necessarily in the best way. The religious leaders falsely accused Stephen. And that brings us to Acts chapter 7. Stephen is brought up on these accusations, and he gives this long speech that basically walks through Israel's entire history. He talks about Abraham, Joseph, Moses, and his point is clear. He says, essentially, God has always been at work, but his people have often resisted him. He's not trying to win an argument. He's speaking truth, even though it's uncomfortable. Faithfulness does not always mean popularity. Sometimes telling the truth makes people angrier. Oftentimes telling the truth makes people angrier. So eventually, Stephen directly calls them out for resisting the Holy Spirit, and that's a breaking point. He looks up and he sees Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and then he's brutally stoned to death. And as he is dying, Stephen does something incredible. He asks God to forgive the people who are doing this to him. Who does that sound like? Who else, with some of their last breaths, asked God to forgive the people who were abusing them? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's what Jesus said. That is Christ-like forgiveness. And it is powerful, even in suffering. In his death, that's what Stephen said. He said, Lord, forgive them. And in those final moments of Stephen's life, he looks a lot like Jesus, which is the goal for all of us, right? Really powerful. And then in the very beginning of Acts chapter 8, it says that Saul, who later will become the Apostle Paul, it says he approved of Stephen's death. And from that moment, persecution breaks out and the church is scattered. But here's the twist. What looks like a setback is actually God's setup. That scattering is what spread the gospel beyond Jerusalem, beyond the early church. So overall, Acts 6 through 8 reminds us that God uses ordinary servants, that obedience can be costly, and that even suffering can move God's bigger plan forward. Stephen's life was short, but his faith made an eternal impact. And every time I read it, I'm like, wow, you know. So it was a heavy one today, but it's a good one. So I'll see you all back here next week. Thank you. Bye.